This is what the UFC Lightweight Rankings looked like in February 2013. That's when the UFC started tracking rankings in the UFC. So right now we're going to go on a time traveling trip forward from 2013 to present day to see how the UFC rankings got to how they look like today. So let's get started. We're going to start with one of my favorite fights. Josh Thompson defeated Nate Diaz by knockout. Nate Diaz dropped from the rankings. Donald Cerrone entered the top 5. Benson Henderson defeated Gilbert Melendez, but nothing changed. Gilbert Melendez stayed at number 1. Pat Healy defeated Jim Miller, which bumped Jim Miller off of the top 5 and opened up a spot for Josh Thompson to move into the top 5. That fight was later deemed a no contest after Pat Healy popped for, some of the... TJ Grant defeated Gray Maynard, which bumped Maynard down to 5, Donald Cerrone off of the rankings, and as you can see, TJ Grant to number 3. Now this is going to be pretty sad because this is the last time Grant's going to fight in the UFC. You'll see what happens. Anthony Pettis defeated Benson Henderson, moving Anthony Pettis to the championship spot. Benson down 1, Gilbert Melendez down 1. Speaking of Melendez, he defeated Diego Sanchez in an incredible fight, but didn't move in the rankings. Nate Diaz defeated Gray Maynard, bumping Maynard off the top 5 and Diaz back to number 5. And this is what the rankings looked like at the end of 2013, a stacked top 5 champion in Anthony Pettis. That number 6 and 7 though, both of those guys, keep an eye on them. Into the beginning of 2014, Benson Henderson defeated Josh Thompson in a close split decision. Nobody moved from that win. Khabib Nurmagomedov defeats Rafael dos Anjos, which puts Khabib in the top 5. Now keep an eye on Khabib. He gets injured after this fight and is out for 2 years, but he stays on the rankings, and just watch what happens. Speaking of injuries, speaking of people possibly getting knocked off the rankings, this is the sad part. TJ Grant, he gets concussed, he just stops fighting, and he gets removed from the rankings. Also, Nate Diaz, who's in 6th at this point, also gets removed due to contract negotiations. Benson Henderson defeats Khabilov, so he doesn't move in the rankings. And then RDA defeats Jason High, but he doesn't move in the rankings either. Donald Cerrone defeats Jim Miller, keeps his spot at number 5. And while we went a bit without a shift, Josh Thompson was defeated by Bobby Green, knocking him off of the top 5 and putting RDA at the number 5 spot. Right after entering the top 5 for the first time, Rafael dos Anjos defeats Benson Henderson. He gets bumped up all the way to 3rd, Henderson down to 4th. And then Donald Cerrone defeats Eddie Alvarez. That puts him 1 spot above Benson Henderson. Then Gilbert Melendez is defeated by Anthony Pettis in a championship fight. That moves Khabib up to number 1. And if you were listening before, like I said, Khabib has yet to fight. But then Rafael dos Anjos defeats Nate Diaz, and he is now crowned the number 1 contender, and this is what things look like at the end of 2014. As you can see, we got Edson Barboza at number 6. There's Miles Jury sneaking in at number 8. Bobby Green for his win over Thompson. Split decision though, gets in at number 9. And Eddie Alvarez. Keep an eye on that Eddie Alvarez kid. To start 2015, we saw Donald Cerrone defeating Benson Henderson, bumping Cerrone up to 3rd at the lightweight division. And then Benson Henderson, with no time in between, defeated Brandon THATCH at welterweight, so that didn't affect anything. But what did affect things is Rafael dos Anjos defeating Anthony Pettis to become the UFC Lightweight Champion. Then Donald Cerrone got a win over John McDessie, knockout win. That puts him up to 2nd above Khabib Nurmagomedov, who again hasn't fought in a bit. And remember what I said about Eddie Alvarez. He was hanging out at the 10th position. Well, guess what? He beats Gilbert Melendez. That bumps Benson Henderson off the top 5, Melendez down to 5, and Eddie Alvarez all the way to 4th. And then even more bad news for Gilbert Melendez. USADA catches him, popped for something to do with banned substance. Okay, I'm going to go with that. So, boom, out of the rankings, Michael Johnson, you get the number 5 spot. But hold your horses, Michael Johnson. He loses to Beneil Dariush, and that brings Tony Ferguson to the number 5 spot. But don't worry, Tony Ferguson defeated Edson Barboza, so he then deserved the spot. Rafael dos Anjos gets a win over Donald Cerrone, and Nate Diaz defeats Michael Johnson. All that does is move Khabib up to number 2, again after not fighting. But remember that Nate Diaz-Michael Johnson fight, because even though it did nothing for the rankings, that fight begins the timeline for the screwiness of the lightweight division, okay? Because Nate Diaz calls out Conor McGregor after that Johnson fight. And this is where things just go bonkers. But anyways, here is your top 10. You see Michael Johnson in at number 6, Nate Diaz, like I said, at number 8, Beneil Dariush, number 9, and Al Iaquinta at number 10. Can you imagine if Al Iaquinta ended up with a title shot? That'd be crazy. So we start the year with Eddie Alvarez defeating Anthony Pettis. Alvarez moving up to that number 1 contender spot. And then Donald Cerrone moves to welterweight. So, off the top 5. For now, though, Nate Diaz in at number 5. And speaking of Nate Diaz, he fills in for Rafael dos Anjos, who injures himself, who was going to fight Conor McGregor, who is not on this list. I know, McGregor screws up all history and rankings. Anyways, though, instead of Rafael dos Anjos against Conor McGregor for the title, we have Nate Diaz against Conor McGregor, which does nothing for the rankings because the fight's at welterweight. Anyways, Diaz defeats Conor McGregor. Nobody moves. And Khabib Nurmagomedov defeats Horcher? Daryl Horcher? Yep, it was supposed to be Tony Ferguson, but you know, as you're gonna see, Tony Ferguson and Khabib Nurmagomedov are never supposed to fight. Anthony Pettis falling on really hard times after losing his championship. He gets defeated by Edson Barboza. Pettis off the list. Nate Diaz back to number 5. Oh, Tony Ferguson all the way up to number 3 now. Donald Cerrone defeats Patrick Cote at welterweight. That doesn't affect his position at lightweight. Eddie Alvarez then becomes UFC champion, defeating Rafael dos Anjos. Moves into the championship position. Rafael dos Anjos drops to number 2. Tony Ferguson defeats Lando Venata, who was supposed to be Khabib Nurmagomedov. That doesn't change anything in the rankings. Edson Barboza defeats Gilbert Melendez, bumping Cerrone off the top 5 and giving Barboza his debut at number 5. And then Conor McGregor defeats Nate Diaz in a welterweight fight, which does nothing for the division. And then Tony Ferguson defeats Rafael dos Anjos to claim the number 1 contender position. Khabib and dos Anjos both get bumped down to number 2 and 3 respectively. And here is the event that flips the lightweight division on its head. We're going to start off with an easy one though. Khabib Nurmagomedov defeats Michael Johnson. He gets bumped up to number 1, but look out! Conor McGregor defeats Eddie Alvarez. He now takes the championship position. Everybody else gets bumped down. Ferguson 2, Alvarez 3, RDA 4, Nate Diaz 5. And that's how we're going to end the year. Wait, Nate Diaz, just for fun, Barboza goes ahead of you. Alright, now we're done the year. And this is what the end of 2016 looks like. We have Conor McGregor as the champion, Nurmagomedov number 1 contender. This is looking good. This is a stacked division. Who's excited for Conor McGregor to be champion? Well, as you all know at this point, nothing really happens during this year. So we're just going to fast forward through this year because, yeah, not a lot happens. Diaz is inactive, so down to 8. Johnson and Chiesa get bumped up to 6 and 7. Barboza defeats Dariush. That puts Poirier up a spot, Dariush down a spot. Rafael dos Anjos leaves lightweight, so everybody gets bumped up a spot. Hey, there's Al Iaquinta again. Kevin Lee makes his debut on the rankings by defeating Chiesa, moves up to number 7. And then Justin Gaethje debuts in the lightweight division, defeats Michael Johnson, gets a top 5 spot. And then Tony Ferguson defeats Kevin Lee, becomes the number 1 contender and the interim champion. Then a random shuffle puts Barboza at number 3, Alvarez at number 4. Poirier defeats Pettis, moves up to number 7. Pettis just not even close to the rankings now. Alvarez defeats Gaethje, moves up to number 3. And then Nate Diaz still hasn't fought at lightweight forever, so he moves down to number 8. And then Michael Johnson moves to featherweight. and Dustin Poirier gets bumped up to number 5. And that is 2017. As you saw, a lot of potential. Not a lot happened though, other than some debuting fighters in the division. Justin Gaethje, Kevin Lee make their rankings debut, but at the end of the day, ended up falling out of the top 5. And this is what has happened this year in 2018. It's been a more active time at the top of the division this year. Khabib Nurmagomedov defeats Ali Kinta, becomes champion. Yes, 2018, that's what happens. Conor McGregor down to number 1, Tony Ferguson down to number 2. Dustin Poirier defeats Justin Gaethje, moves up to number 4, Barboza down to number 5. And then Kevin Lee defeats Edson Barboza, putting him at number 5. And that's where we are right now. So to wrap things up, this is how the lightweight division looks. And that's how everything's happened throughout the last, I guess, 5 years in the lightweight division. We've seen a lot of craziness. Of course, Conor McGregor being the biggest, whoa, what the hell in the division. And we've seen a lot of fighters fall off. Interesting note, the only fighter who stayed in the top 10 out of all of these guys, do you know who it is? Well, there's actually 2 of them. It is Nate Diaz, who should really not be in the top 10 anymore, and the champion, Khabib Nurmagomedov. Yes, if you go back to the beginning of the video, Khabib was at number 10. 5 years ago at number 10, it took him 5 years to get all the way to that championship spot. So congrats, Khabib Nurmagomedov. That is your history of the UFC lightweight division. Tell me who you would like to see next. As always, thanks for watching. Make sure to watch all our other videos at SB Nation. And yeah, thanks for watching.